Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you back to the third in Professor Harrison's series of Gifford lectures, Science, Religion and Modernity. My name is Oliver O'Donovan. I'm Professor of Christian Ethics. I have a special interest in many ways in that I was able to overlook fairly closely the negotiations and discussions which about 10 years ago set up the Andreas Idrios Chair of Science and Religion in Oxford University, in which Professor Harrison is the distinguished second professor. And I think when those discussions were going on, it probably didn't occur to those innocents of us who imagine we control intellectual life when in fact we are swept along on its current, of the enormous importance that would be played in the discussion of this subject by intellectual history. And I think if anyone has been in doubt of that importance up till now, Professor Harrison's lectures will have done quite a bit to persuade them that to get to the bottom of the relation of science and religion is to get deep into some very important currents in Western history and the ways we have framed our inquiries and understood them. Last time, he was introducing us to the medieval idea of the cosmos and the way in which nature was conceived in the inquiry. Today's lecture is called The Disenchantment of the World. Professor Harrison, please let's welcome Professor Harrison.
Well, thanks for that introduction. It's good to see you all here this evening. I concluded the last lecture by suggesting that, amongst other things, in the patristic period, the Christian doctrine of creation played a significant role in the demystification of nature, and that this was evident in the fact that the first Christians, unlike the vast majority of their contemporaries, did not hold with astrology or magic, anthropomorphic deities, or the divinity of the heavens. Now, given that our topic for this evening is the disenchantment of the world, it may seem that this has already taken place. Nonetheless, during the Middle Ages, Christian thinkers were to imbue nature with religious meaning and to reinvest it with causal powers. And these two approaches I refer to here in the outline as the order of meanings and the order of causes. And it is these things that will change and disappear with the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Now, for those of you who've read the abstract of the lecture, and I hope it's not many of you, you may be under the impression that the bulk of the lecture will be given to point 4. It will in fact be spending quite a bit of time setting up how the world, to some extent, becomes re-enchanted in the Middle Ages before the great and profound changes that take place in the 17th century. So I'm going to begin with this first level of order, the order of what I've called the order of meanings. Now, to begin with, the features that I want to draw from on the last lecture are these, that in the religious sphere we have the interiorization of religion and a new emphasis on the importance of written texts. In the scientific sphere, and bear in mind that this is not a term that works very well for this period, but in the sphere of natural philosophy, we have an emphasis on the way in which this natural philosophical enterprise was deeply integrated into the philosophical life, and this philosophical life includes significant elements of spiritual exercises and the idea of an ascent from the visible world to the invisible realities. Now, linking these elements in the patristic period in the Middle Ages is this crucially important idea of the book of nature. The premises of the metaphor of the book of nature may be found in Scripture, According to the book of Genesis, for example, God places lights in the heavens for signs and for seasons. So the heavenly lights thus served not only a practical purpose, but as far as later interpreters were concerned, they acted as signs of eternal verities. As is well known, Psalm 19 announces, quote, that the heavens declare the glory of God and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Less well known, perhaps, are the verses that follow, in which the psalmist suggests that the heavens offer us a wordless form of speech. Day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them, yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the end of the world. Now, in the New Testament, the key passage is Romans 1:18-20. I've mentioned this one before, and which, as we can see here, this passage refers to the invisible things of God that can be seen through the visible creation. Now, this passage is rehearsed over and over again through the centuries when people are attempting to give theological interpretations of the natural world. And there's a book in the interpretation history of this passage, which hopefully someone will write one day. Now, this passage provides a crucial link to Greek conceptions of the order of nature. And I'll just give you one very quick example that I mentioned briefly 2 weeks ago. Manifest things are a vision of hidden things, says Anaxagoras. These are also connected to this division of knowledge that we looked at in the last lecture, the Aristotelian division of the sciences, where we have physics or natural philosophy, mathematics and theology, distinguished by their respective objects. And although we tend to think of this as a set of disciplinary divisions, we can also think of these activities as stages through which the individual must progress in order to achieve the true philosophical life. Right. Now, the passage in Romans also affords considerable scope for patristic writers to talk about the significance of nature. Origen, for example, the Alexandrian church father, takes up these themes about the visible and the invisible in his commentary on the Song of Songs. So he starts off with the premise Paul the Apostle talks about the visible and the invisible, and then he goes on to say that all of the things in the visible category can be related to the invisible, the corporeal to the incorporeal, and the manifest to those that are hidden. Now, for Origen, there are hidden theological and moral meanings in all created things, for, as he argues, in much the same way that human beings bear the image of God, so all created things have a likeness and a resemblance to heavenly things. Now, Origen contends that these deeper layers of meaning, the meaning of things, can be found in the Scriptures, while the superficial reader of Scripture is content to rest in the literal sense, which for Origen is equivalent to the visible world. The more profound meanings are to be discerned in the deeper allegorical and moral layers of Scripture, and these take us to the hidden depths. Now, while not all patristic exegetes agreed with the specifics of Origen's approach, and while we encounter multiple reading strategies among the Church Fathers, Origen is typical insofar as his whole interpretative endeavour is shaped by the Christian story of redemption, which extends from the origins of the cosmos to the final consummation of all things. This story is not only recounted in the words of Scripture, moreover, but is built into the very fabric of the cosmos and is inscribed on every creature. In short, nature too is a book upon which we may contemplate in conjunction with the reading of the words of Scripture. Now, a number of the Church Fathers will pick up on this, deploying the metaphor of the book of nature. And I'm going to give you this rather complicated version of the metaphor by one of the most influential monastic writers of the patristic period, Evagrius Ponticus. And he suggests, as you can see, that the book of God involves the contemplation of bodies and incorporeal beings in which the purified mind comes to be written through knowledge. For in the book are written, he says, the words of providence and judgment, through which God is known as creator, wise, provident, and judging. So through contemplation, Evagrius contends, the human mind becomes a third book on which the divine logos is inscribed. So although this is a very different conception of the order of nature from that we find in classical writers, it still draws upon the idea of personal transformation as a key element of the engagement with nature. So this, as I've said, is a key element of natural philosophy during this time. Now, a number of the other church fathers deploy this image of the book of nature: Athanasius, John Chrysostom, Augustine. And so henceforth the book of nature will become an enduring metaphor in the West, typically, although not invariably, expressing the idea of a concord between the interpretation of the natural world and the interpretation of Scripture. Now, hand in hand with this idea of the book of nature went a notion of allegorical interpretation. For the later fathers and for much of the Middle Ages, they employed a fourfold strategy for interpreting the words of Scripture. They referred to the literal sense, the anagogical sense, the tropological sense, and the allegorical sense. Now, rest assured, I'm not going to attempt to explain to you what each of these four categories is about. Literal sense you can probably figure out, but it's the allegorical sense that I want to focus on, because the allegorical sense was the sense of Scripture that actually got you from the words of Scripture to the objects of the natural world, and thus held together this whole hermeneutical enterprise through which words and things were together interpreted. Now, the best way to see how this works is to consider how Augustine explains what allegory means, and he does this in De Doctrina Christiana. And here he says that allegory is not just a technique for reading multiple meanings into texts. Allegory, rather, is a way of understanding the meaning of the objects of the natural world. And this is how Augustine sets it up. When we read Scripture, he says, when we understand what object a word refers to, we have grasped the literal sense. But the allegorical sense consists in understanding what the meaning of objects in the world is. So objects bear a meaning, and to understand the allegorical sense, we have to understand the meaning of objects in the world. So we have these two senses together: literal sense, understand how a word refers to an object; allegorical sense, how objects refer to other words. Now, I'm going to give you a specific example of how this works in a moment, but that's the theory. Now, later medieval references to the book of nature are going to be quite explicit about how this Augustinian system works, and I'm going to give you an example from a later Augustinian thinker, Hugh of St Victor. But just to get it clear in our minds, then, the book of Scripture is understood in this sense, and the book of nature is understood over here in terms of the words, the meaning of the objects of nature. So here is Hugh of St Victor giving us how this metaphor operates. And so the sensible world, he says, is a book written by God, created by divine power, and each creature is like a figure, not invented by human decision, he says, but rather instituted by the divine will to manifest the invisible things. So here again we've got this play on visible and invisible, but the creatures are invested with meanings by God himself, who intends to communicate to us. So every creature on this understanding has been designed to manifest some divine truth, and Hugh thus invokes the Augustinian theory of signs, insisting that, quote, in divine utterance, not only words but things have a meaning. Now, this conception is again rehearsed by Aquinas, who doesn't really buy into allegory in a big way, but at least he's giving an explanation of how this operates. And what he says here, in essence, is this: allegory is not about words having multiple meanings. What allegory is about is God's capacity to give objects meanings. Now, as he says here, the things signify the word. The things signified by the words can be types of other things. Okay. So that's how it works in theory. Just to give you an example of what this amounts to in practice then, the specific application of this theory of signs was given, for example, in the medieval bestiaries, which were elaborations on an earlier work called the Physiologus. This was the original source for all of the medieval bestiaries. Now, in these books, we find animals, plants and stones all given theological and moral meanings, so that the reader, when encountering these natural objects, will be put in mind of their true and deeper significance. And the example I'm going to use from the bestiaries and from the Physiologus is the description of the pelican, which gives us perhaps the clearest idea of how this works. And I'm going to give you the description found in the Aberdeen bestiary. Since we're in Scotland, let's run with the local version. And the description goes like this. If the pelican brings forth young and the little ones grow, they take to striking their parents in the face. The parents, however, hitting back, kill the young, and then, moved by compassion, they weep over them for 3 days, lamenting over those whom they killed. On the 3rd day, their mother strikes her side and spills her own blood over their dead bodies, and the blood itself awakens them from death. Now, I'm not entirely sure where this observation of pelican behaviour came from, but nonetheless, it's there on the authority of the Aberdeen bestiary, and indeed all of the bestiaries repeat this crucial story. And the commentary then on the meanings of the story, you're probably going to work out for yourselves, but just to give you an idea from the bestiary, in the mystic sense, the pelican signifies Christ, Egypt and the world. So there are the 3 different objects that the pelican signifies. So the pelican lives in solitude as Christ alone condescended to be born of a virgin, etc. It is solitary because it is free from sin. It is the life of Christ. It kills the young with its beak, as preaching of the word converts the unbelievers. It weeps for its young as Christ wept with pity for Lazarus. And after 3 days it revives its young with its own blood, the crucial bit, as Christ saves us, whom he has redeemed from his own blood. So we get the sense here of how the objects in the world function to convey these deeper theological meanings. So the pelican then in the Middle Ages becomes an enduring symbol of Christ's atoning death. Accordingly, its habitat ranged widely through medieval literature and iconography. It can be seen perched precariously above the pulpit in Christchurch, Oxford, as I'm sure Professor O'Donovan knows very well, and he would have preached under it on many occasions. We see it also in the front quad of Corpus Christi. It adorns the lectern at Norwich Cathedral. It can be seen in the painted glass of various cathedrals and the altar of St Giles in the Fields in London. In his famous communion hymn, Aquinas speaks of the pelican. Dante refers to Christ as our pelican. Less favourably, Shakespeare's Lear denounces Regan and Goneril as those pelican daughters. And the pelican still lingers on, curiously enough, in the coat of arms of the US state of Louisiana. So there you go. There's a story in there, I'm sure. Now, at any rate, in an age before evolutionary theory offered an explanation of the sheer number and diversity of living things, it made sense to think of God as having provided various creatures for food, clothing, medicine, and other uses. But the vast array of living things exceeded by a significant margin all that could be encompassed within these categories. So the question, why pelicans, and indeed why any number of living things, could be answered by referring to their deeper symbolic significance. This is a rather different natural world from that which we currently inhabit, as indeed it was different from the world of the ancients. Understood in these symbolic terms, it was a world that was not primarily to be explained causally, nor to be exploited materially, but to be read, meditated upon, and understood. Now, I'm just going to say something here about contemplation as a key to understanding the natural world, again with a view to reinforcing this idea that natural philosophy, the approach to nature that dominates not merely in antiquity but the Middle Ages, is essentially about personal formation rather than knowledge of and transformation of the world. Now, in an information age, we tend to think of the process of reading as a means to an end. Reading provides us with access to information, or in those rare moments of repose, offers a pleasant diversion. For the medieval reader, the process of reading both scripture and the natural world was simply not one of mechanical translation, but one in which the interpreter of nature underwent personal transformation. I'll just give you one example. The Cistercian monk, Arnoul of Boharis, flourished in the 13th century, says this: When you read, seek for savour and not for science. The Holy Scripture is the well of Jacob, from which the waters are drawn, which will be poured out later in prayer. Thus there will be no need to go to the oratory to begin to pray, but in reading itself, means will be found for prayer and contemplation. So Scripture is studied in this context not in order to confer knowledge, scientia, upon the reader. Rather, the words of Scripture were to be savoured and digested in such a way that they would provide fertile subject matter for prayer and contemplation. Now, in this long-standing tradition of prayerful reading, Lectio Divina, the divine words of Scripture were ruminated upon and literally tasted with the heart. The reading of Scripture, then, was not primarily to acquaint oneself with doctrines, nor even to learn moral lessons, but to engage in contemplative practice. And in this respect, then, there is a parallel with ancient philosophy, where ancient philosophy is similarly understood as a practice that was oriented towards spiritual formation, rather than, as I've said before, to do with the assertion of particular doctrines. Moreover, given the intimate connections between the contemplation of the words of Scripture and the contemplation of the creatures to which the words of Scripture refer, the books of nature and Scripture together constituted the subject matter of this contemplative practice. Now, again, an example here of the Franciscan Bonaventure, very long quote, but here's how you see that this process is involved in contemplation. So as he says, the world's a shadow, a way and a trace, a book with writing front and back. I think he's using the, yes, not quite sure that's actually in Ezekiel, but it was in his version. Now, indeed then, he says, every creature is a refulgence of the divine exemplar, but mixed with darkness. The soul sees these things, it must go through them from shadow to light, from the book to veritable knowledge which is in God. Now it's interesting, he says, to read this book is the privilege of the highest contemplatives, not of natural philosophers, for the former alone know the essence of things and do not consider them only as traces. Now, part of the background here is a controversy going on in the universities where natural philosophy had now come to the fore. And this is a reaction against that, because what Bonaventure wants to say is that natural philosophers, insofar as they only remain at the level of the visible things, don't really get it. They don't understand the true meaning of things. And that understanding only comes through a personal transformation of the individual and a progression beyond the visible. Now, nonetheless, this is not inconsistent with the classic hierarchies of learning that we considered in the last lecture, which similarly suggest that natural philosophy is the beginning of an exercise that begins with the sensory world before progressing through the more spiritual things of mathematics to the higher truths of theology. Thus, the book of nature metaphor and the meditative reading habits that accompanied it are indebted both to the textual orientation of Christianity that we spoke about last time and the spiritual practices that characterised classical natural philosophy. The Christian narrative of creation, fall and redemption also deeply informed the goals of contemplation of the creatures, since, as Bonaventure pointed out, Adam's original dominion over the creatures in the Garden of Eden consisted of a mental mastery of what it was that they represented. In the state of innocence, he says, quote, Adam possessed knowledge of created things and was raised through their representation to God and to his praise and reverence and love. Now, as a consequence of the fall, Adam's intimate knowledge of the symbolic significance of the creatures was lost. The partial reacquisition of this lost knowledge then, says Bonaventure, is, quote, the goal of the creatures and the way in which they are led back to God. So in knowing nature, we're engaged in, or in contemplating nature, we're engaged in what's essentially redemptive exercise. Hugh of St Victor, one of Bonaventure's predecessors in this Platonised version of Christianity, had similarly argued that the liberal arts are pursued in order to restore a divine likeness in the human mind. Again, a likeness that had been lost as a consequence of the fall. Now, similar motifs can be found in a range of medieval thinkers: John Scotus Erigena, Michael Scott, Vincent of Beauvais. And I'm not going to give you the specific examples from them. Now, we can note in passing, because I'm going to talk about this in the next lecture, that two related features of early modern science feature here. The centrality of the fall narrative in motivating scientific inquiry and in shaping its methods, and the idea of re-establishing a lost dominion over nature. So they already appear at this stage in the Middle Ages, albeit in a rather different register, because in the early modern period, these conceptions are going to be turned outwards onto the world, so that dominion becomes a literal mastery of nature. Summing up then, excuse me, we might say that the way in which these figures made sense of nature was through a science of signs. Nature was invested with meanings, theological and moral, and this is where its chief intelligibility lay. Moreover, the process involved was not simply one of acquiring knowledge, but it was a process of contemplation and personal transformation. Now, before moving on to discuss an alternative way of ordering, what I called the order of causes, let me flag up two early modern developments that we'll talk about in next lecture. First of all, note that one of the significant features of this contemplative understanding of nature that we have considered is this Genesis imperative to exercise dominion over the creatures. In this medieval context, it's understood to be an intellectual exercise in which gaining an understanding of the symbolic meanings of the creatures provides the way back to God in a fallen world. Now, as I've already hinted, in the 17th century, this internalised understanding of the mastery of the creatures will be turned outwards onto the material world. And again, however, this literal mastery of nature will still be understood as part of a redemptive exercise and part of what motivates scientific endeavour. That exercise, as I've said, will in essence be the new science, and it will draw its legitimacy from the claim that it is a fulfilment of one of the original purposes of the creation, that human beings exercise dominion over nature. So once again in this development, we see the interiority of a conception of mastery turned outwards, and that's the pattern that we've looked at in terms of religio and scientia. The second thing I want to flag up is it's probably worth saying something briefly about how all of this relates to the project of natural theology. For it's tempting for 21st century readers like us to think of any theologically motivated interest in nature as falling under the rubric of natural theology. Natural theology understood as the study of nature yielding neutral premises for arguments that establish the existence of God and certain of his attributes. In other words, the conception that nature offers evidence of God based on reason alone to those who are disinclined to give much weight to revelation or religious authority. So I have in mind here Lord Gifford's understanding of a science of natural theology, which, as he expresses it in his bequest, is, quote, devoid of reference to or reliance upon any supposed special, exceptional, or so-called miraculous revelation. Now, for reasons that I hope are obvious, we ought to resist the temptation to apply this label to anything that's going on in the patristic and medieval approaches that I have just laid out. For a start, engagement with natural philosophy in this pre-modern period is thought to offer a particular kind of mental training that will both facilitate moral behaviour and theological insight. So the mode of knowing is more like a direct experience than inference from premises. Moreover, what one knows as a consequence of this is not restricted to a fairly limited range of truths that we typically associate with natural theology. God, certain of his attributes, immortality, maybe post-mortem rewards and punishments. Rather, nature offers a parallel revelation that bears testimony to the triune nature of God, to Christ's redemptive death and resurrection, while at the same time reinforcing a specific set of moral prescriptions. To offer just a couple of examples, Hugh of St Victor insists that the Trinitarian nature of God can be known through meditation on the magnitude, beauty and utility of the creation. Bonaventure, who we've got up here, I can persuade him to move on, says that the creature of the world is like a book in which the creative Trinity is reflected, represented and written. This clearly then is not natural theology in our sense of the word. That project, at least in as much as it involves science offering premises for arguments that lead to God, doesn't really get off the ground until the 17th and 18th centuries, when it's made possible by new conceptions both of science and of religion. And I'll talk more about that. Let's turn now to an alternative way of ordering the natural world, what I have called here the order of causes. And we move then from a discussion of allegory to analogy. With the rediscovery of Aristotle and the rise of the universities around the 12th century, we see the appearance of a significant alternative to the monastic Lectio Divina and to the Augustinian Platonist approach to the natural world. And the background here is that with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries, the textual remains of classical learning had been preserved largely in encyclopedic digests. This means that the early Middle Ages were heir to a very thin version of the classical world. The 12th century witnesses the rediscovery of a thick classical tradition, and in particular the works of Aristotle. These had been preserved in the Arab world and in the eastern half of the empire. The rediscovery of this thick classical tradition was also accompanied by urbanisation and the rise of the medieval universities. Bologna starts in 1150, Paris around 1200, and Oxford roughly early 13th century. Simplifying the matter somewhat, we can say that we now have a new site of intellectual activity, the medieval university, and a new philosophical conversation partner in the form of Aristotle. These new sites of learning, the medieval universities, have a generally positive approach to Aristotelian thought. They don't displace the monastic, Platonic, Augustinian order of symbolic ordering that we've spoken of, but they do offer a revised model of the nature and purpose of natural philosophy and its relation to theology, and hence a different conception of what each of these things entails. Part of the impact of Aristotelian thinking was to bring a revaluing of the material world in its own right and a reconsideration of how knowledge of the world related to knowledge of divine things. A key principle was Aristotle's insistence on the priority of sensory knowledge. Now, whereas the trope of relating the visible to the invisible had traditionally been read as endorsing the idea of an ascent from the material to the intelligible realm, it could also be interpreted in a more Aristotelian way. And here is Aquinas giving us this version. He seeks to preserve the idea of an ascent from the material to the intelligible, but this is now expressed in terms of an Aristotelian principle that there is nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses. We go from the senses to the intellect. That's the move. And from this principle, Aquinas draws the conclusion, and here it is, that whatever is said of God and the creatures is said according as there is some relation of the creature to God as its principle and cause, wherein all perfections of things pre-exist excellently. Okay. So what Aquinas is saying here is that we have another way of understanding God from the creatures. It's not merely to do with what they symbolise, but we understand something of God because he is the ultimate cause of the creatures. So in addition then to their symbolic capacities, the creatures provide a way to understanding God as their cause, since to some degree effects resemble their causes. And this is the basic supposition of Aquinas' famous analogia entis, or analogy of being. This assumption can justify the more formal study of the natural world as represented in Aristotle's writings on natural things, his Libri Naturales, works that come to occupy an important place in the arts curriculum of the medieval universities. Thus, Thomas's teacher at the University of Paris, Albertus Magnus, can say, not very complimentary to the annals, but there we have it. From this knowledge, from the knowledge of these vile animals, we can ascend to the knowledge of the first cause, just as we ascend from effect to cause. And you can see here that Albert is commenting on De Animalibus, which is a collection of the three Aristotelian writings on animals. So in the context of this commentary on Aristotle, he says part of the justification for what we're doing here is that we understand God as the cause of these as he puts it, vile animals. Now, it's tempting for the modern reader to see this discussion as depicting a particular kind of relation between theology and Aristotelian natural philosophy, science and religion, if you will, and I think to some extent that's a legitimate reading. But the point I would like to draw out here is that the appropriators of Aristotle, I think, are less interested in using his science to support theological propositions than they are in seeing the whole exercise as promoting particular kinds of virtues broadly understood. And this is the theme that we talked about the previous two lectures. That is to say, what's involved here is a particular kind of mental training or mental formation. And here's Albert the Great on this theme. This training, he says, awakens a capacity in us, not only concerning its particular object, but as he goes on to say, this is a generic capacity. So part of the reason we're engaged in the study of natural philosophy is not because we're interested in learning about animals per se, not even necessarily that we're interested in inferring things about God from them, but that it imbues us with a particular set of capacities. So science then on this understanding is a mental habit rather than a body of knowledge that offers premises for arguments. And this is what I said in the very first lecture. This understanding of science scientia, moreover, applies across the board to the science of natural philosophy and to the science of God or theology. So here is Aquinas making a similar kind of point when he says that understanding God from the creatures is not an exercise in what we would regard as philosophy of religion, but as he puts it here, is part of the contemplative life. Since, however, he will say God's effects, reading from the top there, God's effects show us the way to contemplation of God himself, and then here he invokes the passage from Romans. Once again, different context from Origen and Augustine, but we can see how it's operating here to essentially explain the purpose of the created order. So then it says, it follows then from that the contemplation of divine effects belongs to the contemplative life inasmuch as man is guided thereby to knowledge of God. Now it's important then to reduce neither natural philosophy, which is the closest equivalent we've got to science, nor theology, then known as sacra doctrina, to familiarity with the relevant doctrines. Thus, for example, in proposing that sacred doctrine is a science, Thomas Aquinas is arguing that it's a practice that leads to a particular state of mind, as a consequence of which one can habitually move from cause to effect. In the very first question of the Summa Theologia, he thus states that the unity of the science of theology comes from the fact that it is a faculty or habit. So science is something in us, it's a faculty or habit that applies to the science of theology as much to the science of natural philosophy. Just to give you a secondary source on this, John Jenkins, in a book called Knowledge and Faith in Aquinas, Cambridge 1997, quite helpfully points out this, that the purpose of a science of sacred doctrine, that is a science of theology, is, quote, to induce habits of thought, intellectual habits, in virtue of which a person's knowledge of the cause becomes the cause of, the epistemic grounds for, his knowledge of the effect. Its purpose, that is to make one's thinking in a particular field mirror the order of causality. Now, as we can see, that sounds a bit complicated, doesn't it? All he's saying for our purposes is that this is mental training that we're engaged in here, not knowledge of things, but it's an inherent capacity that we're after. So the pursuit of philosophical wisdom was not simply to do with the accumulation of knowledge of particular objects. Rather more important, it entailed becoming a particular kind of person. The attainment of wisdom, as Aquinas notes at the very beginning of the Summa Contra Gentiles, relates to a specific office, where office is understood as possessing certain virtues. Moreover, for Aquinas, the process of knowing calls for the mind of the knower to become conformed to what is known. Okay, that's his epistemology, as it were. Knowledge of the truth, which is ultimately identified for him with contemplation of God himself, thus entails growing in conformity with the divine nature. To quote from Aquinas, the rational creature is made deiform of the form of the deity. Now recall also that for Aristotle, contemplation is the activity of God, and the contemplative life is possible for Aristotle, quote, insofar as something divine is present in man. Okay? So there's this element of deification here that's very strong in the Greek tradition, and which the Protestant reformers are not going to like very much. As one progresses in the knowledge of the first cause, of necessity then one acquires a certain rectitude, because the knowledge is a transforming knowledge. So what's really going on in the pursuit of both natural philosophy and theology is a process of training and apprenticeship that amounts to what we could call a cognitive restructuring. Now, this understanding of the philosopher as an individual who is undergoing personal transformation will change quite dramatically in the 17th century, when the philosophical task will be directed away from personal transformation towards the transformation of nature. And the disciplines of the individual will be reified into a method by which nature itself is mastered. We call it the scientific method. So the approach taken by Aquinas offers us a complementary conception of how the objects of the world might be theologically relevant, an alternative to Augustine's notion about the objects signifying theological truths. It's not that sensible created things symbolise theological truths, as Hugh of St Victor and Bonaventure would have held, but that in getting to know them, the knower gains a generic capacity that's transferable to other, more elevated objects. Nonetheless, we can say that at the more general level, this conception of science, in common with the monastic practices of Lectio Divina, is consistent with a general idea of philosophy as spiritual exercises. Science is a handmaiden, not so much because it offers premises for propositional theology, but because it entails the performance of mental exercises that ultimately promote the personal transformation that is the goal of theology. Okay. Ultimate truths about divine things can be known only to the properly prepared mind, and the study of nature was seen to contribute to that preparative process. Right. Now we actually get on to disenchantment. Now, I'm not going to go too far into the early modern period because I'm going to postpone in-depth analysis of this disenchanting business to the next lecture, okay? But I want to conclude by giving an indication of what happens to these two ways of ordering the world, what I've called the order of causes and the order of symbolic representations, allegory and analogy, meaning and causal order. What happens to these things with the onset of modernity in the 16th and 17th centuries? I'm just going to make 5 quick points, and I'm going to lay them out, and I'll dig into them more in the lecture next week, first lecture next week. What happens to this stuff? First of all, there will be a collapse of this symbolic worldview. And this occurs for a number of reasons. It is overdetermined, as historians say. One important reason, I think, is the change to biblical hermeneutics that sees a move away from allegory and towards the literal sense of Scripture. And this is promoted strongly by the Protestant reformers, but everyone takes it up eventually. Now, when this takes place, there is no longer a justification for claiming that objects have a meaning. This is because, as we've seen, allegory is about the meaning of objects. And if you don't have allegory, you can't have objects having a meaning. So if we do away with the allegorical sense, what we have done then in effect is we've done away with objects' capacity to refer, to have symbolic representation. And then we ask ourselves, how do we reorder these things? Okay? And science will step in, science as we call it, but they're still at that time calling it natural philosophy and natural history, will step in to reorder the natural world, although they will do it in a theological way. That's one. So the symbolic worldview collapses. It has significant implications for how nature is to be ordered. Second, accompanying the evacuation of meaning from the natural objects is a stripping away of their intrinsic causal powers. Okay, so the causal thing is going to go too. This takes place, interestingly, when an Epicurean matter theory, the matter theory of Epicurus, which was atomic, replaces the Aristotelian matter theory, which had Aristotelian hylomorphism, we say. This is a theory that involves matter and form and efficient and final causes. All of those causes go, and they are replaced by an austere atomism in which causal powers are taken right out of the world and increasingly given back to God and to God alone. And although it's somewhat paradoxical, the argument will be made that Christianity has stronger natural affinities with elements of Epicureanism than with Aristotelianism, and that the medieval flirtation with Plato and Aristotle had taken things down the wrong path and had given rise to a remystified cosmos that now has to be stripped of both its symbolic meanings and its causal relations. Now, as a consequence of these two developments, explanations of nature will no longer make reference to meanings, nor increasingly to causation. A world of inert atoms was seen by many as more consistent with the sovereignty of God, who now becomes virtually the sole causal agent in the natural world. Insofar as causation is invoked at all, it will certainly be denied that effects in any way resemble their causes. And so even if we do talk about causation, the analogy of being, where effects resemble causes, will go. What replaces these two orders of meaning, the orders of meaning and causation that I've talked about in the lecture tonight, will be the idea of mathematical laws of nature. So we ask, what happens to the objects? They are going to be reordered according to these mathematical laws of nature. That is in the realm of natural philosophy. In the realm of natural history, which is to do with living things, mathematical laws of nature to the cosmos and to the physical world, taxonomy will restructure the living world. Now, the Newtonian law of universal gravitation is a prime example, because that substitutes for causal explanation a mathematical description in terms of law. And as we discussed in the question time of the very last lecture, what now counts as a scientific explanation changes quite significantly, where mathematical description in terms of laws of nature replaces explanation in terms of causation. Okay. Thirdly, if the causal and semiotic powers of natural objects are stripped away, interestingly, the inherent capacities and powers of human agents are also called into question. Both moral and intellectual virtues will be reconfigured, and largely on theological grounds. I should have said that the conception of laws of nature is also introduced on theological grounds. As we've already seen, Protestant reformers attacked the Aristotelian notion of habit, virtues as habits, because for them, this view of virtues as habits was complicit in a mistaken view of justification. But added to this is a concern also for the moral and epistemological consequences of human sin. For early modern thinkers, the problem with the scholastics was not an emphasis on faith, as a cliched view of history would have it. Rather, it was their overconfidence in reason that was the problem. This had led them to affirm elements of the pagan tradition, details of pagan natural philosophy in particular, on the assumption of a shared and generally reliable human rationality. Again, then, the task of early modern natural philosophers, as they saw it, these people in the 17th century who were doing science, was to reconstruct a science of nature that in their view was genuinely Christian and which took cognizance of the frailties of post-lapsarian human nature, about which pagan philosophers had known nothing. This religiously motivated skepticism was a driving force behind experimental natural philosophy. Generally, we can say that the task that 16th and 17th century natural philosophers set themselves was that of purging pagan elements from natural philosophy and re-Christianising it. Although, as I've indicated, to a degree, this called for the baptising of Epicurean matter theory. Fourth out of 5, the priority of the contemplative life will be sharply criticised by both Renaissance humanists and Protestant reformers. The latter are armed with a very powerful conception of religious vocation, and the idea that the contemplation of nature is primarily for the purpose of personal transformation will be replaced by the view that nature is to be studied in order that it itself will be an object of transformation. The goal of the philosopher was not thus that of self-transformation, but of transforming the world, and that will be also interpreted as a redemptive process. Fifthly and finally, to return to one of our leitmotifs, the virtues of religia and scientia will both be reified. They will become things, and they will come to refer primarily to activities and bodies of knowledge rather than qualities of the individual. This development is intimately linked to the first four things that I spelt out. These themes briefly outlined here, we're going to take up in much more detail in the next lecture when we consider in depth the relevance of a range of theological considerations for the emergence of modern science in the 17th century. Thank you.
I'm still trying to formulate the question, because that was such a rich and dense, many-layered presentation that what I think I'm grappling with is the idea of, I now forget whether you said that it was considered at the time, or whether you shared that view, that this mystification of nature, nature as symbol, was a wrong turning. Right. Now it seems to me that from my limited knowledge of theological history or church history, one question of mine has been, it seemed that both in modern science, since the turn, maybe with Bacon or whatever, which you're going to come to, but also religiously, there was little concern for nature in the way that we now, there's been a turn back to the sense in holistic approach to nature, in organics and that. And so I'm really asking whether you think that's true in what I've just said, and also hoping not to jump the gun in terms of the possible re-enchantment of nature.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's probably worth clarifying that I've made no normative judgments whatsoever about these various options. And I think what we will see, well, let's jump the gun, right. What we're going to see in the 17th century, that we have a relatively impoverished theological vision of the significance of nature as a consequence of this series of evacuations that I've just sketched in the 5 ways. So maybe there is an implicit normative judgment there, that if you say which is the more theologically rich vision of the natural world, what you end up with in the 17th century is a few premises from which you infer things about God, his wisdom and power, basically his existence perhaps, and his wisdom and power. So that's a very thin theological payoff, as it were, for studying nature in the way that became commonplace from the 17th century onwards. So for the next lecture, you can draw your own normative conclusions, because I think the contrast between those ways of reading nature is going to be fairly clear. So I'm not suggesting that this was a wrong turn, okay? And I'm going to let the comparison do the work, and you can make up your own minds. But when your point about where we are now, I think the reinvesting of nature with significance, it's in the extreme form will be the Gaia hypothesis, for example. But at a more moderate level, we say, well, we have an ethical concern. That ethical concern may reflect a particular view of nature. It may simply reflect human self-interest and a utilitarian common sense framework. We say if we wreck this, we're going to wreck it for ourselves and for future generations. And that's just a standard, that's a standard application of moral theory that doesn't require us to invest any special significance in nature. Now, there's an interesting question, though, about whether, in order to change people's behaviours in terms of how they relate to the natural world, whether you do need some kind of fundamental underlying value system that is presently missing. And I think that's, again, a question that we may take up in Lecture 6 when we talk about, I'm not sure it's science and the future of religion, or religion and the future of science, but we'll be talking about the future and the relationship between those things. But this is a long answer to your question. There is a hypothesis about the death of nature in the 17th century, and the death of nature is presumed to be a premise that gives rise to the despoiling of nature environmentally. what I think happens is that this biblical injunction to have dominion does actually function in that way, and we'll see how that's the case in the next lecture.
Thank you. Can I follow on from that by asking, I guess, a two-pronged question? One is that the pre-modern enchanted nature, I would stand corrected if you can, but I don't know that it necessarily carried any kind of behavioral connotations that we would associate with environmental movement today.
Yeah.
That is, nature may be enchanted, but you treat it, I don't know that animals were treated any better or that land was treated any better or anything else in that period.
Yeah.
The other part of the question is in the de-enchantment, or let me put it this way, more in the theological realm, the move away from allegory, in part, in biblical hermeneutics and theology, as I understand it, was a complaint that allegory doesn't lead to any discovery of things. In allegory, you can only be reminded of doctrinal truths that you already know. Yeah. And the Protestant reformers are trying to say, no, we want to go to Scripture to discover things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it similar that one could say that at least the earlier version of an enchanted nature doesn't allow much in the way of discovery, which we associate very much with science today as discovery of things?
Yeah.
That's
no, but okay. No, both good points. I mean, as to the first one, yes, I think you're right. I don't think there's any sense in which this symbolic ordering of the natural world acts as a kind of preservation against the exploitation of nature. And this I think goes to one of the difficulties with the Lynn White Jr. thesis, which says it's Christian conceptions of dominion over nature that drive environmental exploitation. Now, I think he's half right, but in any human civilization, people exploit the natural environment because that's what they need to do in order to survive, and that is as true of the Middle Ages as it is now. The difference is, though, I think that in the 17th century, natural science gets a particular impetus from the biblical imperative, and technology then gives you the means to exploit in a way that's just not possible before. So you're quite right to say nature is not imbued with the kinds of values that would lead to an environmentally sensitive ethic. What you don't have is you don't have the brake on this literal understanding of dominion, and once the brakes come off that in the 17th century, we end up where we are today. Now, on the question of biblical hermeneutics, I mean, what I should clarify that the Protestant reformers don't have the slightest interest at all in at least in this respect. They're not interested in some theory about objects in the world. This is sort of collateral damage, as it were, from their hermeneutical interests. So they're interested in the literal sense for a particular reason, and that's partly related to sola scriptura and so on. We'll talk more about that in the next lecture. And so the consequence that I've spelt out here is nothing in their direct intentions. And indeed, this is true of most theories that link Protestantism and natural science. It's not as if the Protestant reformers are crazy about science, but the unintended consequences of things that happen as a consequence of the Protestant Reformation will end up moving in that direction. But just to go back to your point about whether you can discover anything new, I think that's right. The other element that you get in the 17th century is a temporality, and the idea of and we'll talk about this in lecture 5, the idea of the possibility of progress, which is the incremental addition to knowledge, which is completely missing, precisely because of the reasons you're talking. It's really an anamnesis. You're constantly reminding yourself of a static spatial pattern that's there, and you don't have the capacity for an ever-expanding magazine of knowledge, as it were. And again, people like Bacon are going to be quite explicit about that difference. But which is better, of course, depends on, again, a set of value judgments.
So I just wonder if you could comment on how significant do you think the development of perspective was in this whole mathematization of our understanding of nature?
Yeah, again, this is a good question, and the development of perspective is one of a number of areas where mathematics is actually applied to things. Now, if you were here for the last lecture, Aristotle has this distinction between natural philosophy and mathematics and theology, and the idea is that the methods of natural philosophy and the methods of mathematics, we keep them separate. But there are mixed mathematical sciences where we apply, or subordinate sciences, or Aquinas calls them scientia media, middle sciences, where we do this mixing up business, where we apply maths to specific kinds of problems. But these tend to be subordinated to one or other of the key disciplines, natural philosophy or mathematics. But what happens in the Renaissance is that these mixed mathematical models, and that happens in mechanics and statics and, as you say, perspective and optics, these then take on a significance of their own, and people understand that the Aristotelian the Aristotelian strictures on mixing the methods don't give you the optimal outcome. And where you end up then is, and I've said this on a number of occasions, is where you end up with is in Newton, who directly contravenes the rules by saying, I'm going to talk about the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. But you're quite right to say it's these practical activities that set the scene for the breakdown, the breaking of the walls between the mathematical realm and the realm of natural philosophy. But, I mean, while I'm on the topic, I mean, the other thing to say is that this is also made possible by a breakdown between a notion that you have a progressive movement through from the study of natural philosophy through to the objects of mathematics, through to the more elevated objects of theology, understood as a kind of philosophical formation. Once that goes out the window, then these disciplines are cast in a whole new light, and mathematics doesn't become a kind of way station towards the higher truths of theology, but something that you can apply in practical ways, and that's why we end up with, in a sense, these subordinated models actually become the model for doing science.
Yes, I wanted to ask about this apparent shift between of turning the whole enterprise inside out, so that initially it appeared to me that somehow the fall represented some form of alienation from alignment with the truth or with nature, and that could only be corrected by, and this seemed to be a major enterprise, to correct oneself by virtues and habits. And that then shifted to a different enterprise, perhaps in despair, to try and correct the world because this other enterprise was not going so well.
I mean, I think you're right. I'm not sure that it's that the other enterprise doesn't go so well. I mean, I think there are two things that happen, and one that I've hinted at is that the Protestant reformers are a little bit suspicious about the notion that human beings can perfect themselves by acquiring particular kinds of habits. They see that as an Aristotelian importation, and they see it as not strictly in accordance with, say, Pauline teaching about the fallibility of human beings and, as you say, the significance of the fall. So that's part of what's going on here. And certainly in the 17th century, you get a much stronger emphasis. You get a rehabilitation of aspects of Augustinian understandings of the fall and its noetic and moral effects. But I think the other thing that happens is that we actually get a split, and Bacon is explicit about this, where he says, look, there are two consequences of the fall. One is a moral lapse, and the other is what happens to the natural world, which kind of becomes wild and crazy. Now, for the allegorical interpretation, you know, when the beasts go wild as a consequence of the fall, that's psychologized, and that's the passions going wild, and we need to re-establish a mental control over the passions. That's the sort of move that's on. Now, Bacon says, yes, we do need to do that, and that's the role of religion, but now we have another activity, which is actually to get the world back on track as well, so that we understand the fall has caused the natural world to be changed for the worse. The pagan philosophers knew nothing about this, right? So what we need to do as part of the redemptive process is not merely to get ourselves back on track, but to re-establish dominion over nature and to get nature back on track as well. And so that's the sort of move that happens in the 17th century.
Well, if one judges the quality of a lecture by the interest of the questions, I think that we will all agree that this has been an outstanding experience. We've been given a vision. It may not be precisely Lord Gifford's vision, but it is a vision of what a theology of nature, a natural theology, can be, and why it can be so important. So let us express our appreciation again to Professor Harrison. Thank you.
This production is copyright The University of Edinburgh.